Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 2 of A Cultural History of the United States. The second part I call No History for You, in which I try to explain why America really avoids having a history and that it's a functional necessity for our culture, or the way our culture functions, to not have a history, which makes it very different from most other cultures. I would also like to at first thank everybody who submitted questions. Couldn't do them all, but really enjoyed that. I hope it was helpful to you. Please, submit more questions, and hopefully we'll keep doing that, because I think it was fun for me, so I hope it was enjoyable for other people as well. I thought one thing that might help here is to, as part of a recap of episode 1, is to just briefly, you can look up definitions of cultures, right? There's many different definitions, but they tend to hover around the patterns or behaviors or traditions and habits of a specific group of people. And this is why I spent so much time in the first lecture trying to outline the ways in which the geographical spread, the rate of immigration, and the mass migration internally all make, if you just read a couple of standard definitions of culture, you'll see it makes having shared traditions and habits and patterns of living very difficult when, again, like in Michigan or Minnesota, where 90% of the people for a while were new, hadn't ever been there before. The population is doubling or tripling every 20 years or going up by 10 times. Or you're settling in a place where you have no coordinated history or belonging or sense of being. Now, and so the idea here, what I'm trying to express, is that where most cultures are based on these shared traditions of history and behavior and habits that change over time, but they change relatively slowly in general, and migratory patterns happen, and they've shocked cultures, historically speaking. But if you look at China or India or Europe, so we're talking, Southeast Asia, these are 80% of the world's population, many parts of Africa. They've been fairly stable with moments of interruption and civil wars. All this, not the bad things in history hasn't happened, but it's happened over this overlay of deep, abiding traditions and habits and patterns of living. And that's just not available in the United States. Another element that turns out is not available in the United States is history. Like, we do not have access to our history, and I want to talk about why. But when you don't have these deep-seated patterns and this deep-seated access to history and shared sense of the past, what happens is, and this is one of my core arguments, is to understand the United States, is our culture is built around how people respond when they don't have all the things that are generally there to make a culture. So this is the weirdness of our culture, and why it makes the United States hard to understand at times, and why things that seem weird and inexplicable are actually perfectly understandable once you get this insight, or series of insights related to the notion that we're building a culture based on the fact that we don't have all the elements that everybody else or most other peoples have used to have cultures historically. And so this makes your culture weird in some pretty profound ways. And so that's what I want to explore starting the third episode. But for the second episode, I want to talk about something else that we lack. So we lack the geographic continuity, the populist continuity, all of that would normally allow people to structure and develop a sense of culture simply was not available for most Americans through most of American history, as discussed in part 1. So in part 2, let's talk about American history and why it's not just that we don't care about history, although Americans famously don't care about history or know about history. Being ignorant is fine. That's okay too. But it's that functionally we can't have history. We are precluded, interestingly, we are precluded culturally from really having history, which almost seems like a contradiction, but hopefully it will become clearer here very soon. So if you go back to pre-Columbian North America, where the United States will eventually be established, the range of possible populations in pre-Columbian North America are dramatic, from 5 to 20 to 50 million, right? So it's this big range. Nobody seems to be able to figure it out. But one of the interesting things that is telling is that we also don't seem to have spent a huge amount of effort trying to figure it out, which is a bit concerning, as that is the foundation of North America. But in any case, we can just go with a round figure, say 10 million. That's sort of conservative and in the middle. Is it accurate? I have no idea because, crap figures in, crap figures out. But if there were 10 million-ish Native Americans in North America, pre-Columbian contact, the arrival of Old World diseases wiped out, again, because we don't have the other figure, hard to figure out the second figure, somewhere between 50 and 80% of the population. But it's not so much the numbers themselves that matter. It is that what this means is that settlers were encountering civilizations and cultures that had already been seriously degraded or even destroyed, because this just dramatic impact of old world diseases in the new world was just, they did not have resistance to smallpox. They didn't have resistance to all of this collection of diseases that had been developed in Europe and the Middle East over time, and all the trade routes and all that. And so when traders contacted Native Americans, then those Native Americans contacted other Native Americans, and so on. So it wasn't that it was the colonists who were spreading disease, although they were spreading disease as well. Generally speaking, it was by the time colonists arrived, as opposed to just immediate traders or fur trappers or whatever, it had been, 5, 10, 50, 70 years earlier that the diseases had spread through. So this wave of destruction of Native American culture had already taken place. And so the Native American cultures that colonists in North and South America, actually, but focused on North America here, were encountering were already destabilized, shifting. Like some agrarian societies had already shifted out of agriculture because apparently so much of the population died. Their old traditions of agriculture could not be sustained. Populations, plummeted. Cities aren't, viable when this happens in some cases. So already there was, even before the colonists arrived to set up camp, there's already been these waves of destruction going out in front of them. And so what's being encountered are cultures under stress or already collapsed. So important to keep that in mind. Then you have the date. So if you've, as an American school child, you get the pilgrims show up and have a settlement, and then they have some deals with the Indians, and then pretty soon you arrive in California, right? Like it's sort of quick march across the continent. There are Oregon Trail, some settlers come across, and it's like, all right. But it's important to keep in mind the dates here. So Virginia, which was the earliest English settlement, important to put the English settlement on there, was 1607. And by this time, traders and stuff had already been contacting the New World for, 50, 60, 70 years. So already a fair amount of contact is going on again, and the diseases are spreading and so on. The Puritans arrive in Plymouth in 1620, and Pennsylvania, when you think about how important Pennsylvania is to the Revolution and the future of the United States, isn't till 1681, or I'm sorry, 1661. So there's a good 70 years of run between Virginia and Pennsylvania. So it wasn't like all the colonists showed up all at the same time. And they didn't show up from the New England or from England with the same kind of charter. So there were some that were chartered as business colonies. Some were chartered as personal colonies, like Pennsylvania was the Penn family owned Pennsylvania. And so there had different legal structures. They had different business structures. They were interested in different elements. The Puritans, of course, were somewhat religious, shall we say. And so all of this takes a lot of time to roll in. And the early colonists had to deal with large Native American populations. So they're negotiating and, setting one tribe against the other, which is the whole, the traditional process. And then right before the war, because the colonists keep expanding and spreading out, England fought the French-British War, or the 7 Years' War, and roundly defeated France. And this was fought all over the place. This was not just a North American war, but there was a small North American component to it. But the result of this was the French, who had many colonies, as we'll discuss, in North America, ceded most of that, not all of it, but ceded a lot of that to England. And so the Native American groups that they worked with, and they tended to focus on trading rather than settlements was a much lesser degree of their involvement in the New World of North America. So they were focused more on cooperating with the Native Americans, had a very different set of relationships, although, who knows what would have happened if time had gone on. And they were fighting against the British colonists because they basically saw them as extensions of the British Empire, which they were, allied with the native tribes. So the war is over, France goes away, the native tribes lose some backing and some coordination, and they turn to England and say, okay, now you're the power to deal with. And so the King of England said, hey, what we're going to do is recognize your tribal lands, and we're going to tell our colonists, you cannot go past basically the Ohio River Valley. Don't go any further west than that. And although you hear a lot about the taxes, which were important, this is one of the key instigators of the American Revolutionary War. Right from the get-go, the notion that we would stop expanding and taking land from the Native Americans was completely intolerable. This infuriated in fact, they just ignored it. I mean, this is on the ground. They just did not do this. They said, the king is not here. The army is far away and has lots better things to do. So we're just going to keep expanding regardless. And so, the notion of violating agreements with or legal protections for Native Americans was one of the beginnings of the Revolutionary War. So then you get the Revolutionary War, and at the end of it, America wins, of course. And so at that point, how do we deal with the Native American tribes? The deal is you sign treaties with them. Now, normally, and again, you can look all over the world. If you look in France, you go, okay, they have the caves of Lascaux near where I live now. And the French people consider this part of French history, part of the French cultural reach, right? Like, okay, we go back to the caves of Lascaux. I was in Croatia. They looked to the Greeks. They're like, oh, the Greeks, they were up the coast. They were on the Dalmatian coast. They had their shipping here. You can find ruins around, Roman ruins. So their history goes way back. Now, was there a Croatia then? This is a sketchy question. There really wasn't a legal entity of Croatia, but there was a people and a patterns of life and recognizable things that they can go all the way back. In the United States, that opportunity to settle, cooperate with the natives, form a union that would give you a deep past was necessarily and systematically violated because we never wanted to, or the settlers and the early colonists and the government of the U.S. never wanted to recognize any limits on territorial expansion. And the way you did this is you pretended like the Indians did not exist and had no rights to the land and were not citizens and just needed to go away and were not really human anyway. So this combination meant they're not civilized, they don't understand, they have no history, they don't matter. And so you write them out of history, you write them off of your political agenda, you write them out of your society completely. And this was not, again, this was not a mistake, this was necessary. And so between the Revolutionary War and 1871, when we passed a law saying we wouldn't sign treaties anymore, the United States signed 360 plus treaties with Native American tribes. So that's over a century, 360 plus treaties. These are treaties that were signed and passed by Congress. So these weren't just like, agreements by some random official out in the woods who was doing sneaky deals on the side. No, these were ratified by the House of Representatives as official treaties of the United States government. And I think, give or take, we violated, however, 360 plus treaties. And the standard way this works, and this is from the earliest treaties to the end, is basically one of the elements was simply to say, we're not going to go any further into the Ohio River Valley. That's your land. And then some settlers would move into that land, and the Native Americans would complain to the government and say, hey, we have a treaty. They can't come here. You have to kick them out. And then the government would, of course, not do this. They'd be like, oh, well, whatever, you're not using the land. So then Native Americans would get pissed off, and they'd go over and fight with the colonists, scare them off, kill them, whatever. And then the government would say, well, you've broken the treaty, so now we can take all the land. And then we'd send in the army. We wouldn't send in the army to protect them from the settlers. We would send in the army to protect the settlers who had already violated the treaty from the Native Americans. And so this pattern happened, again, over, not every treaty was specifically this kind of treaty, but a bunch of them were, and this happened over and over and over again. We forced the Native Americans to move. We took the land. We gave them other land. We promised that we wouldn't go any further, and 360 plus treaties systematically violated over the course of a century. So this wasn't a mistake, or this wasn't that there was that one time, we broke the treaty and, the U.S. kind of overstepped the bounds and the Native Americans had to move away. It was just a consistent and relentless pattern for a century. And even when it stopped, not making treaties, we still signed agreements and stuff with the Native Americans. But the violation didn't stop. If you want to read some sordid history, read the history of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is consistently being sued. It's like every couple of years they lose $1 billion case because they're mismanaging tribes. They had treaties that said they're obligated to provide education and health care to certain tribes, for instance, which they just never really do. They're supposed to provide security, which they never do. They're supposed to manage the timber or the land or whatever resources are available, which they always rip off the Native American tribes. And this has been consistent for since we stopped signing treaties. We just started doing this. And so what's happened here is the primary source for having a deep history in North America is erased from the living memory of most Americans. We have nothing to do with Native Americans. Their history is not our history. It's not for you. You can't have it. I mean, they've been here for thousands of years. There's art, archaeology, buildings, city. I mean, there's everything. It's like an unbelievably rich and abundant set of cultural, linguistic, and artistic traditions that are just, we pretend like they aren't there. And again, this is necessary. So if you say, Homestead Act, you can just go and claim some land, and if you farm it for 5 years, it's yours for free. Well, when you get there, you notice there's probably some Native Americans hanging around. You have to just pretend like, they're just, these are just these dirty Indians who won't go away. They've got nothing to do with this 40 acres that I just took. This was virgin territory, as they called it, land that no one had ever seen or been on. Oh my goodness, why is there this massive ruin with nothing to do with me? Just disc it under, or get rid of it or ignore it. It's not a big deal. And again, this is not a one-off. This is a consistent pattern. It was necessary to have that sort of consistent century-long or more than century-long exploitation and appropriation of land to have this mindset and outlook that said, they don't matter, they don't exist, they're not real, they have no claim. And so the deep history of North America, that if, history had worked out differently, would be your normal cultural engagement that, again, if you look all over Europe or all over China, there's been different groups that have merged and mixed and been in a place a long time, and they sort of blur together, and then they look back and they say, we have this long Chinese history, or we have this long, history that goes back to, to the Greek civilization in Croatia, right? This blurring and mixing of settlers and outposts and what, and that gives everybody a sort of shared sense of value and belonging, in places. And in the United States, even the possibility of that was completely written out, because we had to pretend necessarily like there was no history here, because otherwise, what are we doing? Right? Like that is just, we're just wiping out anything that was there and pretending like it doesn't exist. And again, even today in the United States, it's very little studied, very little money for archaeology, very little presence in the culture generally, even though basically everywhere in the U.S. is filled with Indian ruins, artifacts, monuments, cultures, tribes. They're there, they're everywhere. And until they started building casinos 20 years ago, people just completely ignored them, and basically people still completely ignore them. And so for cultural identity purposes and creating a sense of what is America, one of the things we've done is cut ourselves off from history, from that deep history. And to the extent, of course, today that people talk about Native American history, it is in the sense of, no, this is our history, if you're a Native American, this is not the history. This is specifically not the history for the white man, for the non-natives. This is not for you. This is not your history. And so which makes total sense, by the way, if I'm a Native American, probably feel that way too. But it's both sides have agreed that this history has nothing to do with each other. And it's an example I really love. I've used it before, I believe, but in a different lecture series. But they discovered the Kennewick Man in Washington State, and which was a Native American body or skeleton that was found. And the native tribes in the area said, hey, no, that's a tribal member. You can't dig him up. And the scientists said, no, it's just an old body. We can do what we want with it. And so there's this long legal argument that I believe the tribes eventually won. But no one said in Washington State, no one said, oh, no, this is our son. This is the son of Washington State, or this is the son of the United States, right? This is part of our shared cultural history. We want to learn about this guy because this is the deep history of the United States. No, it was the scientists wanted to get some archaeological data, and the Native Americans are like, you shouldn't mess with our burial mounds, right? Like, stop doing that. If you contrast that with the bog man that was discovered in Ireland, same thing, a body was thrown in a bog. The bog preserved it incredibly well. It was found, and when it was exposed and people found it, it was like a national thing, like all over Ireland. People were like, oh, we found one of our ancestors, right? We found somebody that is essentially Irish. Of course, they know he's not Irish in the sense of modern Irish, but they're like, yeah, this is our great cousin. This is old Aunt Sally. I think it was a man. So, Uncle Bob, right? Great Uncle Bob, because it's got to be a couple of generations old, right? But basically, he's an Irish guy. In the United States, zero sense of that. There's no continuity allowed between the Native American culture and Western culture or modern American culture. Ipso facto, you can't have a history, right? Sorry, that history is not available for you. Another aspect of this, of course, not that wouldn't be unhelpful enough, is the notion of African American and slavery. African Americans and slavery and the history of that. And the problem here is that, we don't really think of African American history as, again, being the general history of America or Americans. So if you think about it, though, this is a huge problem. The slave trade, by the way, ran most actively from 1720 to about 1780. It was formally outlawed in 1808. I think 1808, right around 1808. And what's interesting is there is a specific clause in the U.S. Constitution that said you cannot outlaw slavery until about 1808. You can't outlaw the importation of slavery till around the time 1808 that it was, which is an interesting element because that was in the Constitution originally. So the vast majority of African Americans derive their heritage from slaves who were brought over between 1720 and 1780. Well, the biggest waves of immigration to the United States were 1850 to 1920. This is when waves of Italians and Irish and Polish and Jews and Russians, Norwegians, Swedes, right? All these groups came over in the famous millions and millions of wave. So for most non-African Americans and non-Native Americans, your heritage is probably much shorter than most or pretty much all African Americans, who are going to have a much longer heritage and history of being in the what becomes the United States, just because their new African Americans were not being imported as slaves after 1808, but the slave trade had really died down after about 1780, 1790. So that's roughly the date you can think of it as. So if you think of yourself as having an Italian American heritage or Irish American heritage or Polish American heritage, probably those roots are much later than the African American roots, which again are going to be anywhere from 100 to 150 years earlier and deeper. So when you say like, you can't have this as your history, you're going, oh, a significant percentage of the people who live here, who have been here the longest, are also not available, as like their history has been written out, and it's not considered the history of, basically white America. And this, again, is hugely problematic because currently about 12% of the population is African American, somewhere around there. And historically, it's run between, 10 to 15 to 20%. Is, again, census data on African Americans is not that clear until, say, let's go with 1900. Just as a round figure, it gets a lot better. But what's even more important than that, or more startling than that, is states like in, say, 1880, Virginia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, they had huge percentages of their population. Louisiana and Mississippi probably had about 50% of their population as African American. Virginia probably about 30%. And so this is this, again, bizarre never land where you have half the population, or 30% of the population of your country, who have been there a long time, probably longer than most of the other people around. And yet they don't count, right? We're going to write them out of history because that's how we're going to make our identity. Our identity is to not count them, right? Our identity is being built on the concept of we're not them, they're not us. We're superior, we can own them, we can exploit them, we can have slavery. This is how we build our identity. And for people who are curious how important this is, I think you can look at works by a Southern writer like Flannery O'Connor, a great Southern, generally considered Gothic writer, but I really think she's sort of America's Dostoevsky in some ways, because she's very religious in a way that makes people who aren't really religious not understand that she's very religious. It's the same thing with Dostoevsky. He's so religious, he comes off as being not religious to most people who don't understand what's going on. But you can look at two of her short stories, Everything That Rises Must Converge and Revelation. There's just many great ones, but those are two that deal with or treat with this subject. Is that when you get the civil rights movement and African Americans start to be more prominent in cultures, more respected, they started getting, integrated to a certain amount. What happens to white identity? And in both these stories, what you get is the sense that it is totally and completely destroyed, right? This is not some marginal, teeny tiny threat to how the whites are thinking of themselves. This is an existential threat, because if you define yourself as not them, and you've written their history out of American history, how do you deal with this, right? Like it's not a small problem. It's a huge psychological and cultural problem, which of course the United States is not done sorting out yet. Or you can look at you can look at a work like Battle Royal. These are short stories. There's longer works you can look at, but I think, short stories are helpful because they're short. Like Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison, for sort of the African American view on this. Like, what does it look like to try and cross that line? But generally how this is presented is that African Americans enter history when they enter the white world. So Jackie Robinson becomes really important as the first black man to break the color barrier in baseball. Now, this is not a knock on Jackie Robinson in any way, by the way, because it is a hugely important moment in American history. But African Americans played baseball before this. Why he counts when he enters white history, like when he starts playing with whites, then it becomes important. Before that, he wasn't really a baseball player. Like, no, it's not like one day he woke up and I forget who drafted, maybe the Yankees. Some team says, oh yeah, you can play the major league. No, he was playing baseball someplace and he was playing very, very well. But that, again, that's been written out. The history of the Negro Leagues is still controversial. Like, what should we do with it relative to baseball in the United States? And so that completely trying to write out this massively influential, very important, really large and deep heritage population out of your history, it makes you have not a history, right? It just takes another big chunk away. And what's happened now, of course, and again, like the Native American history, African American history is usually presented as the history of and for African Americans. It's not like, oh, this is your history. Like African American achievements are not the achievements of white Americans, right? They're African American achievements. And it's this really interesting and vexed social and cultural phenomena because, I mean, understandably, again, I understand like you have African American History Month is to try to make Americans aware of African American history, but generally it's not presented as, oh, this is the history of all Americans. This is all Americans should be aware of the history of African Americans. This is a huge distinction. Are they us or are they not us? Are we them or are we not them? And if I said as a white American, I said, oh no, that's my history, then people would be saying, oh no, you're culturally appropriating African American history, which is, in a way you would be, because until now it's been not completely, but mostly written out, right? Like mostly we're just going to disregard this and pretend like all these, doctors and great thinkers and writers and, construction that, basically the whole panoply doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the country, non-African Americans. And so you take away, Native American history, so you don't have you have no access to deep history. That's written out, and again, necessarily so. You don't have access to African American history. That's kind of cut off and set aside even by African Americans, right? So this sets them aside. I was pondering this, and when I came across an article, because I'm very interested now about articles about people who immigrate to different countries, and it was an African American woman who had moved to France, and she loved a lot of things about France, but she ended up moving back to the United States, and she said one of the reasons is that nobody recognized her as an African American. And she felt that was such an important part of her identity, she needed to be someplace that recognized her as an African American. And I thought, there it is, right? She's recognized as, she said they would recognize her English and then ask her if she was English, and if not, then, oh, you're an American. And so then she became an American. And when she tried to explain that, no, she was an African American woman, they're like, right, you're an American. Because, right, that distinction doesn't travel as much or as well. And it's like, ooh, right, like, so that cultural identity of separateness, when it goes away, makes you feel like you've lost your identity. And so African Americans tend to want to hold on to that, which again, totally understandable. Read Battle Royal, you'll see the vexed problems here. And that, so it creates all these weird tensions that basically make everybody go, we're just going to ignore all that. History does not matter. And so, of course, the next thing you might think is, well, that's why we look back to our European roots. Even that turns out not to be very functional. So what people may not know, or it certainly wasn't taught very much when I was, again, going to school and studying basic American history, is that there were colonies from almost not all, but many European states. So just stick with Europe now. So you had, France had colonies from Canada, obviously, all the way down to Louisiana to the Gulf Coast. But we don't think of that as French history as part of our history. And by the way, France was our ally in the Revolutionary War, and still somehow we don't think of French history as being deep American history. The Netherlands, New York, New Jersey, this area was called New Amsterdam. But do we count Dutch heritage and history as like the deep history of the United States? I've never encountered that. Sweden, by the way, that's an odd one for most people, had Delaware, parts of New York and part of Pennsylvania. There was a colony there, big colony there. And so do we hearken back to Sweden? Do we say, part of our big history of the United States is Sweden? And Russia, by the way, had missionaries and Orthodox churches in Alaska. But of course, we don't even know what to think about Alaska and all that. And, Hawaii, what the hell is going on with Hawaii? Like, it's just out there. And Americans like, oh, okay, whatever. I believe at one point when Obama took a vacation from when he was president, because he lived part of his life in Hawaii. He went to Hawaii to go home, essentially, and this upset people. They're like, well, presidents shouldn't leave the country on vacation. And he's like, I'm not leaving the country. I'm going to the country. And people are like, is Hawaii really count as part of the country? So we don't even know what to do with Hawaii. But or Spain, forget, Spain, I've talked about these other countries, almost forgot to mention Spain, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, California. I grew up for much of my life in California, and the fact that there's a whole bunch of Spanish missions there, really people overlook. Like mostly, they're there, you can visit them, but basically people are like, oh, no, we're not. We have no Spanish heritage in California, which is, of course, so utterly absurd. It's amazing, to the point where many schools when I was growing up did not offer Spanish as a language, because why would you? Just because you live in a state that has millions and millions of Spanish-speaking people and has Spanish missions, and as some of your oldest non-native artifacts, of course we're going to ignore the natives, but if you're going to ignore the natives, the next thing you get are Spanish missions. Nope, we don't do that, because why would you? What point would there be to study a language like Spanish in California, right? And so even the European history is completely cut off. Like, we're just going to basically ignore that. And so when people say, oh, I have, Swedish American roots, they tend not to mean, oh, some connection with the new Sweden. I'm from Delaware. They tend to mean, oh, no, I had relatives from Sweden who came over in 1920 or something like this. The notion that there is this deep, or was a deep, cultural history of Sweden being in the New World, again, is just written out. It's just erased, because we're pretending like no one was here. It was just virgin territory waiting for us to arrive, manifest destiny, etc., etc. And so what this means is, again, like with the cultural and geographic patterns that would normally be set down, another important defining and coordinating and organizing element for most civilizations and societies is some sense of history. And in the U.S., it was not random that we didn't get history, or it's not just that we ignore history generally. It's that we functionally decided, or acted as if we had decided, that we're going to pay no attention to the historical elements that were available to us, because that would preclude us from being able to, take the land or kill the other people, or I recognize that Spain had ever been here, or whatever, all these treaty problems and violations and things we didn't want to think about. Or we would have to recognize that African Americans are people, and that their history is our history. We're in a shared project together. We're building this new continent together, and here we go. So no, none of this is available. We decided culturally that we weren't going to do that. And so again, you create this huge vacuum. And the great example that I came up with this, it popped into my head the other day, was Oscar Wilde. And so bizarrely, Oscar Wilde did a tour across the United States, a speaking tour. And he went all the way across the United States. This is when the train was finally run, Transcontinental Railroad and all that fun. And he ended up in San Francisco. And when he was in San Francisco, I believe it was in San Francisco. I should have checked this story, but I'm 90% sure it was in San Francisco. If not, it was somewhere on the West Coast near San Francisco, where there was a large Chinatown. And he goes to the large Chinatown, and he said, this is the first civilized place I've been in America. And I was like, wow, that is astounding. But then you think about it and you go, no, not really. Because the Chinese immigrants had formed this, Chinatowns. There was a lot of racism against them. And so they formed these very tight-knit communities and brought over this ancient, long-running, shared language, culture, history, behavior into the New World and set up a Chinatown. And so when Oscar Wilde arrives in Chinatown in San Francisco, he encounters this ancient civilization and goes, aha, civilization, I recognize this. This is what I have at home. I mean, of course, totally different civilization, but civilization nonetheless, recognizable. He could experience it. He could revel in it. But he said that was the only civilized part of the United States was Chinatown. And it took me the longest time to work out why he would say that. And then I'm like, oh, right. Because nothing else is settled. No other patterns have been, everything is so new. There's no depth. There's, nothing is coordinated, organized, shared, deep, either linguistically or historically or culturally. And so the patterns of behavior and habits not set. Again, necessarily so, given the waves of all the patterns that we've talked about. And so, Oscar Wilde drives all the way across the thing to encounter Chinese civilization. They're a little vestige of civilization on the west coast of the United States. And so we've written out as a possible source of historical inspiration all those elements that would allow us to ground our society in even vaguely realistic. I'm not saying other societies have this, specific and really, quote unquote, true chronology of history. It's just that they've built a historical narrative that informs their present and gives them a sense of shared purpose and outlook and all this, even while they debate about everything and has all the conflicts everybody has. This is one of the things that the United States signally and importantly lacks. And hence, again, this is the other part of this vacuum that we have that doesn't allow us to make clear cultural roots in the way and organizations in the way that other societies do. And so I will stop banging on about that now, but I do want to lay this as the very important groundwork for the first two episodes. As the next episode, I'll begin talking about what the outcome of this is, how you can understand certain aspects of American society based on this. Like, how do you build a culture and a society when those elements are lacking? This is what the U.S. is experimenting with. This is the experiment we're running. And again, it helps really explain so much about how our society functions, how it influences the world, how it sees the world, and why much of the world and even much of the people in the United States have such a hard time getting a grasp on what the hell is going on with the United States. So, conclusion part 2. Thank you very much. And again, feel free to post some questions, make some comments, and I will try to, Jeremy will collate them and fill them out, and then we'll do another little conversation on that. And then part 3 will be coming very soon. Thank you very much.